Harry's going to talk about religion today. He asks us to help him explain a little bit of it to the kids. What is religion? It's what people do on Sunday morning. Harry invited his cousin Jim to come to this church, and Jim said he'd rather go walk and look at trees on Sunday morning. Is that religion? Well, maybe. I don't claim to know anything about religion. Does Harry? Well, he's read a lot about it. He likes to think about it. But whether he knows anything of any use to anyone is anyone's guess. You know how he sometimes gets off on tangents. Have you ever heard him ask about religion? Well, not exactly. While preparing for his talk, he tried to give me some idea of what he would talk about. It was kind of interesting because it included you and me. Really? Harry mentioned me? What did he say? Well, he said, you know how you and Maxine are really just toy animals made to look like real animals, and how you can't really think and beware like he is? Of course, I objected to that. I pointed out that we were having a conversation and that he was not intentionally trying to control whatever came into his head for my response. But he just let that comment go. Then he said, well, it seems to me that I am far more alive and aware than you are, Fred, and I agreed with him on that. After all, I've never even been to a movie theater or read a book, and that seems to be a big part of Harry's life. Right now, he talks a lot about the Star Wars movie. Okay. He said, what if there were a being, a presence, something that was as further up the awareness chain from me as he is from you or from me? What if some humans have been able to become aware of that thing, more aware of that thing than others? What if they could experience a connection with such a higher power? Oh, I get it. For Harry, religion is like trying to talk with Yoda. That stopped him for a while. Then he said, yes, kind of like that. It would be more like being in touch with the Force. Fred, did it ever occur to you that he may be nuttier than a fruitcake? Yeah, I thought that. But after all, Maxine, he's our fruitcake. And if we ask him if we can go play rather than talk about this, he'll let us. Let's try. Can we play now? Yeah, guys, you can go play now.
Our speaker this morning is Harry. Harry is a member of this fellowship, and he has spoken here before, and we are privileged to have him back again. So welcome, Harry.
Last night I was asked to list things I thought I did best, and I found that very difficult. I had no problem at all thinking of things I did worst, and one of them was being well organized. Let's see. I have a propensity to, as Gene sometimes kindly reminds me, go on a bit, get a little verbose. The first time I spoke here, I was reprimanded, and didn't you know that it's supposed to end after 20 or 30 minutes? I said, no, you've been coming for years. I never noticed. Anyway, I am going to set a timer to kind of warn me when we get near there. So, my topic today is, I spent some time trying to think up the name of the topic. Religions, what are they? I started off religion, what is it, or what is religion? But I really thought that was too narrow, because religion, how about religions? There are many different religions. And I wrote up pages of my own personal thoughts and my personal history, and then I got to the part that I thought was important. Let's see. I'll go get the part that's important. And you will be happy to know I moved the part that was important to the start of the lecture. and left all the other stuff in cases any time at the end. But years ago, a friend of mine in a Quaker meeting in Scarsdale lent me this book on tape, or lectures on tape. And I was inspired by it. I thought it was great. And I got my own copy. It's called God and Mankind, Comparative Religions. Professor Robert Ogden, President, Kenyon College. There is no published book of this. It's just these tapes. And there are 4 tapes. Each side is 45 minutes. If you'd like to borrow it, feel free. So that's hours of discussion. And I had my own thoughts. And so coming up with 20 minutes wasn't really hard. Getting it down to 20 minutes was or 30 was a little more difficult. So what I'm going to do is first give some thoughts about what I mean by the term religion or religions, and then I will get into, it turned out to be the 7th chapter was the one that I had remembered and was so inspired by and thought was such a great way of viewing religion. So, first, every talk I've given, I think I've done this, I want to start off by saying a couple things. One is I don't believe in believing. And by that I mean there's a definition of belief that says if you believe something and it's challenged, it threatens your soul, it threatens your sense of self, and you will fight. And people fight to protect their beliefs, and they will kill to protect their beliefs. That kind of believing I do not like and want, and do not want to have. Of course, I do have beliefs, but when I identify them, I try to change them, transform them into assumptions. And for me, life should be a series of assumptions. Some assumptions have a much higher probability than others. Later on, I'll mention that I am basically an atheist, but technically, I guess, I'm an agnostic, because how can I be sure? And I ran across a quote on that recently I want to tell you about. A man was saying that he was an atheist, and he said, guys, aren't you really an agnostic? He said, look, he says, there could be a teapot in orbit around Mars. It's possible. And he said, now, I can't say that I'm absolutely certain there isn't a teapot in orbit around Mars, but it seems highly unlikely to me, and I feel the same way about the existence of a paternalistic God. So in that sense, I'm an agnostic. In the same sense, I'm an agnostic about the teapot going around Mars. The second thing I want to tell you about is defining things. I often get into conversations where we get into debates over the exact meaning of words, and I find that very frustrating. I'm not trying to define the word exactly, and I'm not asking you to. I'm just trying to point at a part of culture that I happen to call religion and didn't want to bother to give a new name today. And I'll define for you pretty much what I'm talking about. And you have your own associations with religion. Also, today's talk will consist of a series of focuses rather than a coherent, organized sequence. This may be thought of as a shotgun approach to presentation in contrast to the logical sequence. It may also be a little bit like trying to get a sip of water from a wide open fire hydrant. So hang on. I'm going to call what I'm talking about religion today, and you'll see from the context. I love to quote from Alice in Wonderland. When I use a word, Humpty Dumpty said in a rather scornful tone, it means just what I choose it to mean, neither more nor less. The question is, said Alice, whether you can make words mean so many different things. The question is, said Humpty Dumpty, which is to be the master, that's all. Well, I am the master today. I get to define religion any way I want. The author, in his opening tape, suggested it would be a good start, he was speaking to a large audience, to ask members of the audience to give their definitions for the word religion. And he said, but he couldn't do that. There were too many people, and I feel the same way. However, I'm going to pause here for a minute. By the way, a minute's a very long time when you're in something like this. It's like dead air on the radio. So you're going to experience a minute of hopefully silence. And let each of you think. If you were asked to speak on what is religion to you, what do you mean by the term religion, what would you say? And we can talk afterwards at coffee hour if you want to tell me what you... But the minute is beginning now. That's a minute. Makes you appreciate what a Quaker meeting is like with an hour of silence. So at that point, when I was listening to the tape, I hit the button to stop the tape and wrote down for myself how I would define religion, and was quite embarrassed when he gave like one-sentence definitions and I had a 3-paragraph definition. But I haven't changed it. This is what I wrote. Religion is that part of culture, of the actions and thoughts of a community that focuses more on the spiritual needs and the spiritual well-being of people than do other major components of culture such as education, commerce, industry, medicine, entertainment, and government, to name just a few. In this context, I define spiritual as relating to questions like, is there a God? Are there gods? If so, what can we know about the relationship with that God or gods? Is there any aspect of a particular human that is relevant to our lives that relates to that human before birth or after death? Stated more traditionally, is there such a thing as a soul? Well, after that, I thought of a few more things that I would consider religious questions. My topic today relates to such questions as, is this all there is? How did this reality and our awareness of it come into being? These are the creation myths. And for me, the question that will occasionally spring me into what I consider a spiritual state is, why does anything exist at all? Why? Why should there be anything? That one is, I consider, a religious question. So, and I thought Josie would be in the other room, so I will just embarrass her here while she's here. Last night, or yesterday morning, discussing this, and I mentioned that I was going to speak on religion. And religion, said Josie, who may have heard it somewhere else, religion is what people come up with to explain things they can't explain. I thought, wow, that pretty well hits the nail on the head, you know. I thought that was a good definition. I would dearly love to digress into discussion of the role religion plays in the human culture and how it contrasts and overlaps with that played by science, but I won't. After I've written down my definition, I listened to what the author, Robert Oden, had to say. And he discussed the fact that traditionally, one of the definitions of religion is faith in God. And he dismissed that. And he said, first of all, he said, that limits you to monotheism, so you've got to at least expand it to gods. And secondly, he says, some of the religions, like Buddhism, don't really have a god in a traditional sense. So he dismissed that one. He said, the other one is, Paul Tillich came up with the statement, religion is ultimate concern. And he said, my problem with that is there are ultimate concerns that aren't religious, like maybe staying alive may be an ultimate concern. And that's not necessarily religious. So he dismissed those. And then he went on to say that based on his reading and talking to others, he had what he considered a good working definition for religion. And it's just his specific focus, he said. Religion is a communication system constituted by supernatural beings and is related to specific patterns of behavior. And then he went on to explain each one. He said, first of all, it's communications. It's a two-way street. Religion consists of communicating with something, someone, something else. Second, it's a system. It's complex. It's structured. It has a variety of aspects. It's not just a simple thing. And finally, he threw in supernatural beings, God, angels, spirits, whatever. He said that was important. He said, is secular humanism a religion? No. Because there are no supernatural beings. How about communism? No, not by this narrow definition. I could certainly see thinking of these things as religions. How about Unitarians? I add, are we a religion? Well, some of us believe in supernatural beings, some more than others, but certainly it's not a creed. So I think we're maybe possibly exempted from that definition. He also went on to say that most religions, or all religions, have specific patterns of behavior, ritual, stereotype behavior, repeatable, repeated, and predictable. At this point, I want to list off the major religions of the world and how big they are. Well, first of all, this I got this off of the web, of course. It states the population of the world at the time this was made is 7,167,000,000. And then it lists off the largest religion is Christianity at 2.2 billion. Next is Islam at 1.6 billion. Next, and this is a surprise to me, secular, non-religious, agnostic, atheist, 1.1 billion. Now we're listed later on, so we don't get to be in there. Hinduism, 1 billion. Chinese traditional religion, 394 million. Buddhism, 376 million. Interesting, Buddhism, 376 million. Islam, 1.6 billion. Ethnic religions, excluding some in separate categories, 300 million. African traditional religions, 100 million. Sikhism, 23 million. Spiritism, 50 million. Judaism, 14 million. Now, I was surprised that Judaism was in the top 10. 14 million is not exactly a very large percentage of 7.1 billion. But it turns out that a lot of that 7.1 billion gets picked up in the early top 10, and that there aren't many others that have clear names. There are a lot of very small religions, I guess. Baha'i, 7 million. Shinto, 4 million. Kao Dai, never heard of it, 4 million. Zoroastrianism, 2.6 million. Tenrikyo, 2 million. Neo-paganism, 1 million. Unitarian Universalism, 0.8 million. We are smaller than the neo-paganism group. We're actually smaller than many of the Protestant congregations. Rastafarianism, 0.6 million. So those are the major religions of the world. I thought that was interesting. Now, he goes on. I'm getting up to the good part here, getting close. He said, how do you approach studying religions? What's your angle? Where do you come at it from? And he gave 4 that he thought were very interesting, each of which can be used, and each of which gives everything. The first is religion as history. He says most religions start as a collection of stories about an extraordinarily gifted, enormously smart human being. And over the generations, the stories become exaggerated, and that person gets elevated to a supernatural being. That's the way most religions start, he said. The second way you approach religion is religions as immature science, that they were attempts at science that failed, and often because the people had weaker minds. He threw this one out. He said they didn't have weaker minds. Their minds were just as good as ours. They had different sets of knowledge, and they came up with the best answers they could given the knowledge they had. And here we get into this literal versus symbolic. And there was a great quote going around the internet a few weeks ago, and basically it said, some people think we're so smart because we realized that the statements from the old religions were symbolic, whereas they took them literally. So actually, they are very, very smart, thinking we know they're symbolic, and those idiots in the future are going to take them literally, which is a lot of the fundamentalist faith. Oh, an aside, the last tape he mentions the fundamentalism in the U.S., and the whole. We are one of the most fundamentalist nations in the world. The only other religion which has a significant amount of fundamentalism, like we do, is Islam. The Christians and the Islams are by far the worst, and many, many religions have very little fundamentalism. And we, the U.S., are the epitome of it. We are the products of the Protestant Reformation and the Puritans. And another great quote that came up was, someone had said that instead of the Puritans landing on Plymouth Rock. It would be much better if Plymouth Rock had landed on the Puritans. But we are the product of the Puritans. We all our ethics, our morals, and he said, how come our Constitution differentiates between, freedom and religion? Basically, it was trying to keep the different sects within the U.S. from killing each other. And if you go back and read all the inaugural addresses of all the presidents, which he did, you'll find a strong stream of traditional belief, faith, and all that. And worse, that we are God's chosen people. We are the second Israel, and that we have a destiny, and we must fulfill it. That goes through those addresses. So, religion is immature science. Religion and the unconscious, psychology, Freud, Jung. The idea that we have an inner kind of deep-seated, almost inherited need to come up with something like a religion. And the last one, deep-seated human need like dreams. We want to do narratively what we cannot do in fact. And that this may be hardwired in us too. And the last one, he mentioned the unconscious. What we call the unconscious is a fairly recent construct. Up until the time of Freud and around that era, there was no concept of the unconscious. You won't find it discussed in the Old Testament. So that whole idea is new. And the last one was religion and society. What need in society do religions fill? And one of them is to establish group identities, to allow people to differentiate themselves from others. And the good side is that they will support each other and help with each other. All things have to be dealt with. Children growing up, people dying, people in illness, grief, sickness, happiness, events. The religion deals with these transitions in life and so forth, and that's a social thing. And he also mentioned the negative side of that by allowing us to have a group identity, it tends to be that the other people aren't as good as we are. So that's where all this conflict's coming from. We have strong group identity, and therefore they aren't in our group, so they aren't even quite human almost. For like mating thing, you're not supposed to marry someone from another religion because they aren't really human. That was one of the terms he threw in. The main question facing all of us, does human experience validate or rebut religious dogma? And he said that is on the table as far as he's concerned. Okay, now we get to what I call the good part. Let's see how my timer is doing here. When you realize I skipped over all the other stuff I was going to say, I'm over halfway through the 20 minutes. I plan to go over 20 minutes, I should warn you a little bit. However, his chapter 7 was about Max Weber and an associate of his named Trosch. And they decided to discuss how does a religious community come into being, how does it change and survive over time. And also the basic question faced by any religion, especially in its early years, is how does a religious community survive and change over time as it confronts the problem of reconciling the high expectations and demands of a religious life with dealing with reality and everyday life. And so here's what he said. First of all, he spent some time discussing rituals. I'm not going to go into that, but the importance of rituals and the fact that Americans are very anti-ritual, especially the Protestants. The Protestants, when they broke away from the Catholic Church, one of their main claims was, we're not going to be a ritual-driven faith. We're going to be much more ritual-free. And unfortunately, as far as he's concerned, they threw out the baby with the bath because he thinks rituals are extremely important. And he was the headmaster of a school at this point. He was trying to get rituals into the school to handle transitions, to handle special events and this sort of thing. He said rituals create religious people out of ordinary people, move people through the stages of life, and are a constant reminder that one belongs to one group as opposed to another. He mentioned the Jewish Passover as celebrating the Exodus from Egypt every year. Americans tend to underestimate rituals. Roman Catholics are the religion of rituals. We, the Protestants, are not. And he said often when you hear the term ritual, you hear it referred to as only ritualistic or merely ritual. Now, What did Max Weber and Ernst Troeltsch say? They said, religion, and this is the whole reason for getting out this book and listening to it and giving this talk. Religious communities tend to fall into two categories: sects, S-E-C-T, sects, and churches. Initially, all sects are dependent upon religious experience. Charismatic leaders. The first generation especially, no one is born into a sect. A sect is a spin-off, it's a breakaway. He apologized for the use of the word sect in church. He said, this does not apply just to Christianity. These terms are meant to be used much more broadly. He said, I wish that Weber and Troeltsch had used some other terms, but the terms they use were church and sect, but they apply to Islam, Hinduism, all of them. He said, a sect is a breakaway usually from a major religion. He said the original people like Peter, Paul, and James, they knew Jesus. They were part of the original charismatic beginnings. The second and third generations, etc., eventually they don't have the original charismatic leaders, and they need to have a minister, they need to have an officer, and he gets into this in some detail. Also, they find that it's, in the initial excitement of the beginning, everybody's sort of enthralled and they live the life. But as time goes by, it's hard to live up to the ethics and principles set by the original leaders. He mentioned that St. Paul said it would be very good if you didn't marry. You'd have a much better chance of being a religious person. He also mentioned that at the time of St. Paul, they thought Jesus was coming back pretty soon, so that wasn't a big burden. Had they known it would go on 20 centuries, they might not have been so pushy about it. After a while, he mentions in Christianity as an example, all over the Mediterranean, leaders sprang up in the second and third generation, and each one had a different view. The Trinity is everything. The Trinity is horrible. Jesus was God. Jesus is not God. All these different groups spreading out. So they needed some sort of central office, some sort of officers. Who would be the CEO of each part of each area, land area, for this new religion, this new religious community? And the result was what Weber called depersonalization of charisma. Instead of an individual being the next inspired person to come along, it became an officer. You were appointed into the role of a priest, and you were given the powers. Whether you were charismatic or not was not the issue. And there was a famous case of a group going to the church saying, we want our bishop reconsecrated because the bishop that appointed him was a bad man, an evil man who betrayed us. Therefore, our bishop obviously wasn't made a real bishop. And the church responded by saying, so I have it here, the unworthiness of the minister does not invalidate the sacrament. This was the depersonalization of charisma. So as churches evolved, they ceased to be charismatic and became bureaucracies. They became institutionalized. The office, not the individual, had the spiritual power. It took a specific office to perform a marriage, to baptize. It took a bishop to make a priest. All these things became... In the early days, there was none of that. There was no time for a bureaucracy. Nobody cared who was the chief person. They were all the priesthood of the laity. By the way, the Quakers are still that way. It's kind of interesting. They're kind of like a sect that never managed to evolve into a religion. And I'm a Quaker. And I used to enjoy saying, we are not an organized religion. We are a disorganized religion. So that was the main point that I wanted to get across today in my talk. Was what I got in this book was the concept that all religions start as sects, as breakaways. And he gave some examples. Moses, Jesus, Martin Luther, John Calvin, and so forth. Each of them belonged to another religion, which they found unsatisfying. And they started a sect, which initially had all those characteristics I told you before. Anti-authoritarian, anti-administration, anti-bureaucracy, even anti-ritual. But over time they became churches. So what happened after they became churches? People found them dull and administrative and bureaucratic, they broke away and formed a sect, new church. The Protestant religion is the most broken away religion of any on the planet. There are over 400 major Protestant sects, if you want to call them that, or break parts, because every time they get strong, somebody breaks away and starts a new one. So the gift, charisma, passes from office to office, not from person to person. You end up with professional church people. Okay, I have one more important point to make. This left two significant problems. Remember, this is all his point of view. I don't present this as the gospel, so to speak. What about those people who are not comfortable with the depersonalization of charisma? They want the original vibrancy. They want the original spirit. They want what they saw in the founding fathers of their sect, of their religion. And so that was one problem. And this is a similar problem, slightly different. What about those people who want to focus on the religious life, the spiritual search? They don't want to deal with the needs of everyday life. Now, as churches evolved, someone had to look after the sick. Someone had to counsel the grieving. Someone had to do the ceremonies, the marriage, the funerals, and all that. Well, a person who had a religious bent and really wanted to meditate and commune with what they felt was God or the spirits did not particularly feel comfortable going out counseling those who were grieving. It was not what they wanted to do. So how do you solve this riddle? Well, of course, they might break off into a sect. Well, how do you keep them in? And this was the solution was, and the Christians and the Buddhists both chose this solution. Set up a separate group, the monks and the nuns, let them break away. Let them be part of us, but they don't have to deal with all the day-to-day stuff. They can go off on their monasteries and they can do whatever they do and be as intensely spiritual and religious as they want. And this allows them to not only pursue their own needs, but keep the church vibrant. They become our research group. They become our resource. They become the ones who feed back to us how to stay in touch with God, their God or their faith or their religion. So it turns out that both the Christians and the Buddhists chose this path. And it worked pretty well. One little aside, I remember reading, and this wasn't in this thing, but one of the strange side effects was that many of the Christian monks and monasteries found it useful, of course they were mostly men anyway, but to become celibate. That they found that was one less distraction to keep them from focusing on what they thought was really important. So they chose to become celibate, and that was fine. It didn't cause any problem. However, unfortunately, the Catholic Church at some point decided this is good for all the priests, not just the monks. So they decided that all priests would become celibate. I consider that the major goof of the Catholic Church. If ever there was one, that had to be it. Whoever thought that up was just out to lunch. And the idea of marriage counseling from a celibate person. Not to mention some of the other side effects of that, as we all have recently learned. So anyway, that was their solution. That they would have specialists, monks, who would do the religious bit, the really serious, heavy-duty spiritual lifting, and the other part of the officers with their special given, assigned charisma would handle the pastoral duties, the caretaking, and also raising money, which is a rather important one. Those churches that did not figure out a way to raise money aren't here. Those that did are. The Catholics, they nailed that one. That I thought was, and I should mention the other major solution. The Hindus did not choose to have monks. Well, he sort of waffled, said, I really can't say that, but let's just say in general they didn't. The Hindus took a different approach. They said, I'm sorry, you can't do that now. There are 4 stages in life, and you have to go through the first stage, the childhood and growth and education, and then there's the marriage and family, and then there's the father figure, sort of. And then, in your last stage, you can become a spiritual person. Then you can go off, and so just wait. Be patient. We know you'd like to be a lot more spiritual, but you'll get there. You'll have tents, and you'll be better prepared for it. So they picked a different choice. To the extent that those choices failed, sects broke away and started, and then went down the path to become churches. So that was the main message that I wanted to give today, and I do want to read this one part of what I wrote though. Fred was partly right. Religion is what I do on Sunday morning. I will tell you a little bit about the labels before. I think the important thing I wanted to bring out today was that at least by some definition, religion requires a relationship to the supernatural. That definition seems pretty important. And that's the one that many of us Unitarians have a lot of problems with, but not all of us. I've talked to many of you, and even though you don't believe in anything like a traditional God and the celestial policeman watching over us and keeping score, you do think that perhaps there is a higher power, or there is something more. And it's my question of why does anything exist at all implies that there probably is something more. Let's see. I am a Quaker, I am a Catholic. I am Unitarian Universalist, though I usually say Unitarian. I'm an atheist, though technically an agnostic, and I mentioned the teacup. My father and all my family on that side are Catholics. My mother an Episcopalian from Abingdon. She agreed to let my sister and I be raised as Catholic. I remained a Catholic, never doubting its teachings, until I was in college. The people in churches don't doubt. They're born into them. That's who they are. It's just like being in a family. Though they break away into sects. In college, I dropped out of organized religion and pretty much became an atheist. While living in Columbus, Indiana, I helped start a Unitarian church, became an active member. I again became an active Unitarian in 1970 when we moved to Hastings-on-Hudson, New York, about 30 miles up the Hudson River. I left that church when my wife divorced me to marry one of our friends in that church. I drifted a few years before ending up in my spiritual home, the weekly Quaker meeting in Scarsdale, New York. When I moved to Abingdon in 2004, I became an active member of the church. I was a Quaker for 23 years. I was in the unprogrammed Quakers. We don't have ministers. The other bunch of the Quakers have pretty much a traditional Protestant service, except they have 10 minutes of silence or so. All right. I found an ending point. Lucky you. Next, I want to tell you that my interest in religions was jump-started and fueled for life by a course I took in college. I was taught by a man named Houston Smith. He was the author of a book called The Religions of Man, also known as The World's Religions. And he introduced us personally to some of the best, by personally, I mean we got to meet them face to face. They were friends of his. Some of the best known religious thinkers of our time, including Aldous Huxley. So he'd bring in these people, the most famous Buddhist priest, or whatever you call him, monk of his times, and they would talk to us in class, and we can go up and ask them questions afterwards. And it was just by far the best course I ever took. And every year he was there, he won the award as the most popular professor in college. So that has remained a primary interest of mine all this time, and really was the basis for this lecture.